thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. As Alistair said last year, I was here talking about the wonders of space law. And in fact, one of the two of the crucial issues that affect us in terms of trying to manage outer space, and I've just had the pleasure of being head of Australia's delegation at 2 weeks of UN talks on space in Vienna. But the two major issues about space are the militarization and, for want of a better word, weaponization of space, so military stuff. And the other thing which is related is the environmental aspects of space. So you've all heard about space debris and space junk, and that's for another discussion. But the idea that military activities, if you blow up a satellite, you're going to create hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of debris. So no matter what sphere we're in, there is this inexorable link between environmental issues and military issues. And Alistair, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Peter, for all of your kind assistance, and Patrick, thank you. It's just a pleasure being here again. The Institute really, I look at the program of events that you have, and I feel in awe of some of the speakers you have, so it's a pleasure to be here. So Alistair has very, very succinctly summed up what I'd like to talk to you about, and that is how law deals and does not deal with deliberate environmental destruction during warfare. Now, we all know that, sadly, wars are something that we can't avoid. Humans have been engaged in warfare since they've been essentially on the planet. And we all know that warfare, of course, is inherently environmentally destructive. So where you have war, you will have environmental destruction. And so it would be naive, ridiculous, impossible to advocate for law that says if you engage in warfare, you cannot harm the environment, because that would essentially be saying, there cannot be war. And although that's obviously a goal we would all strive for, it will never happen, sadly. And so the idea is to try to work out what is acceptable within the scope of existing law, and how we should perhaps be establishing rules to put in place conducts of behaviour that reflect our values, and what legal tools should we be using. So, as you're aware, the environment's in all of our consciousness. When I teach my undergraduate students international law or something like that, and I say, well, what do you think international law is about? What are the main areas of international law? And most of them will say warfare, the environment, of course one or two other things. But for those that are 15, 20, 25 years old, in their consciousness, international law is front and centre about environmental norms and protecting the environment in various ways. Now, someone a little older like myself will know that essentially, for the vast majority of international law as we know it since the days of Grotius, the environment was a total irrelevancy. And the so-called environmental movement, if that's the right expression, really only stemmed from late 70s. We had the first IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, issues being raised about climate change and global warming only in the late 80s, and really it's only been in the last 15, 20 years or so that international law has focused a lot on the environment. And the rules relating to warfare, on the other hand, have been around for a long, long time. And those rules were developed out of practice, custom on the battlefield, and then are encapsulated now in a whole range of treaties that you would all be aware of. We have the Hague Conventions of 1907, and we have, of course, the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and a series of other treaties relating to the laws of armed conflict. But those rules were put in place a long time ago, by and large, because they developed out of this practice. They were put in place before the environmental movement arose, before the environment became more and more in our consciousness. But also they were put in place essentially to say to military people, okay, there are codes of behaviour, of course, but we accept that you will engage in warfare. These are the ground rules. And the military, of course, and I pardon my cynicism, military, of course, is always trying to limit the rules that are applied in armed conflict. And so, to the extent over time that these laws of armed conflict did begin to address environmental issues, they did so with such a light touch. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are other branches of law that could also play a role in this, and so I want to talk to you about the role that international criminal law can play. Obviously, international criminal law and the laws of armed conflict, there are overlaps, but they're different sorts of rules with different sorts of consequences, and sometimes addressing different sorts of activity. As Alistair very kindly mentioned, I've had the privilege of being involved with the International Criminal Court for now 11 years, although my period there has just ended. Judge had great pleasure and regard myself in that respect as international law being an area. And so what I've tried to do in looking at this issue is look at it not as an environmentalist, not to sit back and say, let's protect the environment during warfare, although of course that's the sort of consequence that we want to achieve. But rather I've asked myself the question, okay, how can, given that the laws of armed conflict have this soft touch, and it's going to be very difficult to harden that touch because of its historical roots, because of the fact that, for example, as wonderful as it is, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose major goal is, of course, to promote these rules of armed conflict, which they, of course, refer to as international humanitarian law. But they are reasonably conservative in ideas about trying to change those rules. Their fear being that if you start tinkering with these really fundamental rules of warfare, then you may perhaps be diluting their effect or something like that. So the rules of warfare aren't going to move very, very much. But if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, we've had this renaissance of what we call international criminal law. I'll come back and talk a bit about what that is. And that, for me, with all its flaws, and I'm the first to admit that the International Criminal Court and the various mechanisms of justice with which I've been involved and others have many, many problems. We're still at this sort of learning stage about how international criminal law works. We've only got one generation of expertise. And of course you're dealing with egos and incompetencies and people who don't tell the truth and a whole range of issues. So international criminal law is still relatively early on. But yet, it has some powerful sanctions that can be attached to it. And so my goal is to try to use it as a tool to at least address some aspects of this problem. So as Alistair said, history has seen many examples where the environment has been targeted as a victim with virtually no accountability for those actions. Indeed, until recently, any environmental destruction, no matter how significant, and of course we've been through an era of use of nuclear weapons, and I'll give you some other examples later on with some photos. Until recently, environmental damage in warfare has been regarded as collateral damage, one of those unfortunate consequences that come out of military activities and indeed military strategy. A bit like rape, one of those unfortunate things that happens in war. And for a long time, the rules of the laws of war really did not address issues of sexual violence, for example, during warfare. So, for example, we had no prosecutions in Nuremberg of any of the sexual crimes that took place. We still have a whole range of issues, it's for another debate, about some countries and their moral, legal and ethical responsibilities in terms of what happened in previous conflicts. And for a long time, international criminal law didn't deal with rape as a crime. Again, one of those unfortunate collateral things. We wish it wouldn't happen, but it happens. But it's not, and I'm not saying this in a rude way, it's not the main game in terms of warfare. Well, things of course have changed. Our value system has changed. And arising out of that value system, now, rape constitutes a war crime, a crime against humanity, and even in certain circumstances, the crime of genocide, the crime of crimes, if you like. That's only a recent phenomenon. That's international criminal law. For all its warts and flaws, as I say, that is a really powerful thing. It's a reflection of the fact that as our values change, albeit far too late, but as our values change, as we regard international criminal law as a tool to use, as the institutions that administer international criminal law, again with all of their flaws, gain some semblance of credibility, as there is a track record, as there's expertise, as we now have the capability of getting a lot more evidence, all of those things combine to change international criminal law to now sanction that sort of activity. So my argument is it's not based on theory, it's based on the idea that our consciousness about the environment has changed. And to put it in context, remember we're in a period now where we have more than ever do we have conflicts. No longer do we have the red team against the blue team in the middle of a field. They have their battle for the day, and then that's it. Sure, there's environmental destruction, but in a relatively small area. Warfare has changed. The strategy of warfare has changed. And the weapons technology of warfare has changed. And so we now have weapons, of course, that are capable of very, very significant destruction. Not only directed towards people, but also directed towards the environment. So we have a mismatch. Our consciousness about the environment and its importance is growing all the time. And our idea that law should play a role in this. And yet the reality is we're having more and more environmental destruction rather than less in the context of armed conflict. And a lot of that is deliberate. A lot of that is, as Alistair said, targeting the environment as a victim. So, this is a truism. Obviously, there is a lot of law, as I said, relating to the way wars are fought. But there's now an added dimension to that. That is, not only do we look at the means and methods of warfare in terms of how that is directed towards people, and clearly I'm not in any way diluting the importance of that. That is, our main focus. The Red Cross calls the laws of armed conflict international humanitarian law for a reason. That is, obviously, to minimise the suffering of humanity in warfare, given the nature of what warfare is. But we're sort of moving on. We're moving away from, as I said, the traditional view that environmental destruction can be regarded purely as collateral damage. So, some photos just And there's many more. But just to give you some examples of the history, and you could sit back and we could have 100 photos. So in the Second World War, the retreating German forces in Norway, in an area called Finnmark, as the tide of war had turned against them, took a view under a general called Rendulic that they knew that they were being, that the Soviet forces were coming after them, and so they took a view that if we engage in a scorched earth policy and ruin everything as we retreat, that'll slow down the Soviets. Scorched earth policy. Bizarrely, the church remains, but everything doesn't. Scorched earth policies, of course, themselves are not new. I mean, you can go back in history and look at that, and even look at the American Civil War, for example. There's some really, really horrible examples. So, in this case, interestingly enough, the perception of General Rendulic, the German commander who ordered this and carried it out, was that there was a strategic military advantage, i.e. slowing down the pursuing Soviet forces. And in fact, he was wrong. He was mistaken in that. And he was prosecuted under the Nuremberg system for a whole series of other crimes. But when this issue came up, there was some discussion because the Norwegians were, as you can imagine, vast swathes of their country were destroyed. And the Norwegians were really pressing for something to be done. And the Nuremberg tribunal judges said, okay, he's done this, we understand that, but his reasonable perception at the time he did this was there was a military advantage, therefore all is forgiven, even though he was incorrect. Even though he was incorrect in that. And that is the thinking. That's the thinking of the laws of war, to the extent in the additional protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention where they talk about the environment. By and large, they say, thou shalt not, do significant damage to the environment subject to the military advantages. So everything is always subject to the military advantages. And of course the test under the law is, well, what's a reasonable perception of a commander at the time, even if they're incorrect? And it's very difficult to prove, other than, this is what they perceived at the time. So you're all aware of the Vietnam War, Operation Ranch Hand, that was conducted by the United States. Vast swathes of the forest, the swamp area of Vietnam were destroyed as our technology got better with the development of these herbicides. Some figures, 8% of Vietnam's cropland was destroyed, 14% of its forests, 50% of its swamp areas. And of course, there was also human casualties in this as well. Even though I'm talking about the environment, I am a humanist. I'm not ignoring there's a human issues here. But you'll see when I define my crime, injury to humans is not a precondition. I'm focusing here on when is the environment made the victim. Often, of course, that will have effects on humans. So many of you, no doubt, have been to Vietnam. You go to Vietnam. If you are on a tour bus or whatever, you'll be taken to various factories. In those factories are the children of those that were in the forests. All of those children have physical and in some cases mental deformities. And whilst it's incredibly difficult to have cause and effect proof, most people are 99% sure that those deformities have flowed from this sort of herbicide. But here I'm focusing on the environment. Alistair mentioned Dante's Inferno. I've got some, this is from space. Yeah, see, space always works. Space. I try to bring space into every discussion. Okay, so this is from a satellite. This is from a satellite, yeah, which was probably 200 kilometers above the Earth. So, you can't get a feel for how big this is. That's, across there is probably 30 kilometers or something like that, 40 kilometers. This is quite a famous one. In 1991, Helmut Kohl, then Chancellor, said, this is a crime against the environment, which was not an expression that anyone had really used. Coincidentally, that's exactly what I call the crime that I'm offering to you tonight. for insertion in the Rome Statute. This is a crime against the environment. There was widespread condemnation. The retreating Iraqi forces, I think, lit about 700 or 800 oil wells. They poured about, I think, 4 million barrels into the Gulf. As Alistair said, it took months and months and months to clean this up. Thankfully, through acts of God, wind changes and all that, the initially forecast destruction was not quite achieved. I'll come back to that in a minute. But amazing images, and this is just from the internet. You can find many for your heart's desire. Even Werner Herzog was driven to do a movie about it. You might want to look at it at some stage. Lessons of Darkness. Okay, straight after the first Gulf War, there was dissatisfaction, obviously, in Iraq, and there was a Shiite uprising. And Saddam Hussein perceived that the Madan Arabs, who lived in this area, which many people say is the biblical Garden of Eden, in southern Iraq, there were 500,000 Madan Arabs living in this area. And Saddam, as part of an internal conflict, out of revenge and a whole range of other issues, because he perceived that the Madan supported the Shiite uprising that he brutally put down anyway. Under Saddam's regime, a whole series of dams and levees were put in place to drain these marshes. And so the Garden of Eden, focus on that picture for a minute. Looks like that. Where there were once 500,000 Madan, things are slightly improving now. Okay? Obviously they're trying to remediate, but it's impossible to bring this back, of course. But where there were once 500,000 Madan, at its low point there were 10,000 living. Their whole livelihood was destroyed. So obviously massive effects on people as well. But a strategy of warfare, in that case an internal armed conflict, to target the environment. And that obviously had massive consequences. I've read some work recently. I'm involved with the UN, which is looking at this issue, and I've come across some people who were involved in the remediation work here. I think slowly things are happening, but at last count there are only 20,000 now living there. So there were 500,000. And as I said, we could probably talk about many other examples. I haven't put images up here of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. I mean, obviously that's an issue that raises lots and lots of emotion, even in a room like this. And it's not for me to say what's right or wrong. Clearly, I have my own views, but clearly, environmental destruction of weapons like that as well. All right. So, what I wanted to do was try to work out what is the state of law. And is that state of law sufficient, given what I regard now as the moral and also legal imperative to be doing something about these deliberate acts that give rise to massive, very significant environmental destruction? So, and I won't bore you with all of this sort of stuff, but there are a whole range of places to look. Jus in bello is, for those who don't know, another expression. Lawyers love Latin, right? Jus in bello is another expression for the international humanitarian law. So Red Cross calls it international humanitarian law. The military people call it LOAC, laws of armed conflict, and smarty pants law professors call it the jus in bello. Okay, but it's all essentially the same thing. By and large, think of Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, but there's a whole lot more than that, of course. But they are. So clearly it's important to see what they say. I've already given you a sneak preview of what they say and what they don't say. What does international environmental law say about this? As I said, I'm looking at this from a perspective of a criminal lawyer, but clearly if there were environmental treaties that were helpful, then maybe we can use that as part of the sanction. Well, you won't be surprised to know that international environmental law says very little about this. There's even a question mark in many cases as to whether environmental treaties even continue to apply during warfare between the belligerents. But there are no treaties that talk about warfare, no environmental law treaties that talk about the environment in warfare. It sort of goes against the grain of what environmental treaties do. And then clearly it's important to look at what existing international criminal law says, because that's the tool in the end that I want to utilise. So there are a range of other things. So I'll give you the conclusions now, and then you can politely fall asleep or something like that. But the conclusions aren't particularly rocket science. Again, there's that space analogy. Rocket science, given what I've just said for you. So they're clearly, in my mind, and I think in the book and in other talks that I've given in more detail, there's clearly an imperative to use law in the most appropriate way to deal with this sort of activity. The existing law, the jus in bello, the laws of armed conflict, environmental law and other areas don't meet the imperative. And again, I don't want to bore you with the, what each article says and all that, although I've got a little bit of that for criminal law. But please take my word for it. I believe that international criminal law, as I said, is one useful tool. Now, this is where I just need to stop for a minute, because I do a lot of work with the UN. As I said, the International Law Commission is looking at this issue. And then there are a whole range of other NGOs, particularly in Europe, that are very, very active in arguing for what they say a crime of ecocide. Some of you may have heard that, ecocide. And in earlier incantations, people have talked about a crime of what they call geocide. So, crimes relating to targeting the environment. But environmental groups, and I love them of course, but environmental groups don't really differentiate between Exxon Valdez accident, as horrible as it was, and elephant poaching, as horrible as it is, and crimes during warfare. And so what they have argued, and so in a sense they love what I do and they hate what I do. What they argue is, let's create this crime. Great work, Stephen. Let's create this crime that covers everything. And yes, let's put that into the International Criminal Court statute, and it'll cover everything from accidents with environmental consequences to, of course, elephant poaching is serious, but it's not, in my mind at least, the sort of crime that should be at an international criminal tribunal, like the International Criminal Court, which deals with really, I'll go through the crimes. And so what I argue is there are different types of legal tools that we must use in conjunction with each other to deal with these various acts of deliberate, or in the case of Exxon Valdez, accidental but perhaps negligent environmental issues. But they don't all fit into international criminal law, and they don't all belong in the International Criminal Court. And if you try to argue this, you will get nowhere, absolutely nowhere, because states, in the end, the argument about my crime will take 20 years maybe. I hope it's sooner than that, but one has to be realistic, and I hope I'm still alive when it happens. But it has to be focused on what the raison d'etre of international criminal law is, and what the raison d'etre and function of these mechanisms are. But there are other ways, equally important, other ways to deal with elephant poaching, and other ways to deal with industrial accidents, not through international criminal law. That's my argument. But as I say, the environmental groups, really it's more, for a lot of them it's a campaign. It's not necessarily the end result, it's the journey. And so the campaign, and I'm not being critical, it's just that we disagree. I would like seriously to achieve something that I think is possible, albeit bloody difficult. I swore on radio, is that okay? Yeah. Bloody difficult. And that's why I'm here. I'm too old to be trying to just write a book about things that no one will ever read, or it doesn't have any effect. And so, I have a slightly different perspective. So international criminal law is therefore one of a number, but one very useful tool to deal with this issue. And there is something in international criminal law that deals with the environment, which is on, I think, the next slide or whatever. But that is a throwback to this 19th century thinking that the environment is really not important. I.e., we'll put something in there, but we'll make sure that it will never, ever be achievable in terms of a prosecution. And so therefore, in the end, having gone through existing law, I conclude that a fifth crime should be put into the International Criminal Court Statute, the Rome Statute, the copy here, and I call that crimes against the environment. Okay, so I'm talking about international criminal law. Most of you, no doubt, will be aware what that is, but it's an area of law, and I'm not looking, one doesn't look at law in silos, of course, but international criminal law is very much directed towards accountability for crimes that, and these are words that come out of the Rome Statute preamble, crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. So all of you will be aware of the sorts of crimes that are there. I'll come back to that in a minute. International criminal law is about individual criminal responsibility. Tomorrow I'm speaking in Brisbane for the Red Cross about prosecuting businesses under international criminal law. And there's good news and bad news. Good news is we're talking about it. The bad news is you can't do it. Because international criminal law, if you go back to Nuremberg, because in Nuremberg there was discussion about prosecuting organisations and even the state, heaven forbid, prosecuting the state. And Nuremberg said, international crimes, they're horrible things that are committed by persons, not innate organisations or entities. And that thinking has always pervaded. Why? Because states, who in the end create international law, it's far too simplistic. I always say to my first year students, international law is law made by states for states. They don't really want it, they don't really like it, they know they've got to have it, but they know that to the extent there are rules, those rules impinge on their own feelings of what their sovereignty is, and so therefore there's a push and pull sort of idea about it. So international criminal law was developed in a way that, no, you certainly cannot prosecute states. And at the moment you cannot prosecute organisations. There's one exception. One of the new tribunals may have the possibility of prosecuting organisations, but the Yugoslav, Rwandan, ICC, Sierra Leone, all of those certainly can't. The ICC can't. So we do have, and I've just mentioned a few, a whole series of, I call them mechanisms of international criminal justice. Again, that's me being a smarty pants professor, right? They're courts and tribunals, but they're all very different. The ICC is unique in that it's a permanent court. It's here, and assuming that states don't wind it up, it's here to prosecute things that haven't happened yet. Whereas all of the existing mechanisms of justice, by and large, are backward looking. They were set up with a time frame in mind to, okay, horrible things have happened, let's set up a tribunal and let's deal with it in the past. Okay? The International Criminal Court looks at things in the future, therefore it's a threat to states and to leaders. And so, it's done as a treaty and there's a whole range of issues. The United States is not a party, etc., etc. But it still does good work with all its problems. And it's one of these mechanisms. And that's the mechanism that I think presents the greatest opportunity for what I'm talking about, because it looks into the future. Of course, we're talking now about crimes. We all have basic human rights. Our basic human rights are, the law should be such that we should know what is lawful and what is unlawful. So crimes, be they larceny or murder or whatever, parking offences, if that's a crime, have to be drafted with sufficient clarity and certainty so we know that something is a crime. We're now talking about, very serious issues at the international level. If someone is found guilty, they're going to be deprived of their liberty for a long, long time, even life. And so, and remember, to the extent you have these crimes, it's a continuous challenge to states. So they don't want really overarchingly broad crimes either. So you have a human right, I have a human right to make sure that the crimes as such, they're not retrospective, they're clear, but also there's a political restriction on having things that are too broad anyway. So when you define these crimes, that causes you to really sit back and think. And so in a 300 and whatever page book, my crime that I draft, and I'll give you a quick rundown about that at the end, is maybe a page and a half. That page and a half took more time than the other 320 pages, essentially, to really think it through. And of course, one has to justify all of that. Okay, so before coming to the conclusion that we need a new crime, of course, what I had to do was say, well, what about the existing crimes in the rape statute? Because, maybe they work. So you all know that genocide, as I described before, the crime of crimes, is one of the crimes that the ICC has jurisdiction over. You know that genocide is it's a really difficult crime to prove. It's based on, the definition essentially hasn't changed since the Genocide Convention in the 40s, and it revolves around this, what we call dolus specialis, special intention of a genocidaire to destroy a group of people based on either their nationality or their ethnicity or their race or their religion. Just those categories. So there's no such thing as cultural genocide. I mean, people talk about it, but it's not a crime to try to intend to destroy a group just based on their culture or their sexuality or their political views. I mean, all of that was being called for. The father of the crime of genocide, in terms of getting it before the community, was a Polish academic called Samuel Lemkin, who, of course, in the 40s was arguing that genocide should be much broader than it actually was in the end. And again, realpolitik came to the fore. We have this crime, it's defined in relatively limited ways, but it's about an intention to destroy a group of people. So where you're talking about targeting the environment as a victim, it just doesn't fit in there. It's not an actual fit. Then we have crimes against humanity, another incredibly serious crime, but the chapeau of the definition of that crime says that it's where someone wants to engage in a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. So the victim of crimes against humanity is a civilian population. And clearly, some of the environmental things I've talked about obviously have effects on human beings, but I think it's important for us to have a separate crime where you're targeting the environment. That's where we are now. And so crimes against humanity was not an appropriate fit either. And my other point is, even if we tried to put my square peg into either of these round holes, then you run the risk that you're diluting, and these are unbelievably serious, horrible things. And the last thing I would ever want to do is to somehow dilute the seriousness of this by trying to put my square peg in there anyway. So, there's another crime called the crime of aggression in the ICC statute, but it's not relevant for these purposes. But the other core crime in the ICC statute is crime of war crimes. Now, war crimes is where, for the very first time, international criminal law talked about environmental damage. And this is the throwback to the 19th century. So, where we have, some of you will be aware, we classify at law armed conflicts in two ways. You have what's called an international armed conflict, in simplistic, far too simplistic vernacular, state versus state perhaps. And then you have armed conflicts not of an international character, in fraternal armed conflicts, so civil rebellions, and then of course many conflicts actually have characteristics of both. But it's really important to categorise at law what your armed conflict is. I know that sounds bizarre to the non-lawyers amongst you, but the law works that way because there are very different rules applying to international armed conflicts, many more rules about limiting how states can behave against each other. But again, here's the realpolitik, far fewer rules about internal armed conflicts. Why? Because states necessarily resist this idea because it would stop them doing things within their own territory to a greater degree. Obviously, things are changing, but you can see it in all of this, there's the realpolitik behind it. So the existing war crime only applies to international armed conflict. Okay, one has to question why. And by and large, it says that thou shalt not engage in, you can read, an intentional attack in the knowledge that it will cause widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. Okay, the book, I talk a lot about those three terms. They're not plucked out of the air, they've come from other treaties. But to have them in the conjunctive and means the threshold is unbelievably high. Impossible to achieve. But even if you achieved it, even if you could show that someone did that in the knowledge, again, so actual knowledge, that they were going to cause this unbelievable amount of damage, even then, that has to be, quote, clearly excessive. We don't even, that's the first time we ever use the word clearly. So that's even higher than being excessive, although we don't know what it means, right? But words mean something. But you can see, I'm painting a picture of what this, okay? Clearly excessive when you relate it to the military advantage. So the 19th century, early 20th century thinking that, okay, yes, environment, it's important, but it's really secondary importance when you measure it against military advantage. So that's the existing war crime. It was there because environmental groups said we've got to put something in. It was really not a lot of time was spent on it. In the context of drafting the Rome Statute, there were other fish to fry. But they put it in, patted themselves on the back and say, see, we've saved the environment. Are we good? And essentially they've gone backwards. So I argue that we need a new crime, and I should be finishing shortly because I know some of you need to leave. I argue, therefore, we need a new crime. That's not easy. Okay. We've now got the crime of aggression, but that was introduced in 1998 with the Rome Statute, but they couldn't agree on what it meant. So it was only defined in 2011. So I'm saying we need a new crime, a fifth crime. And so to do that, it's going to take some time. Clearly, it's important to speak to governments. It's important to speak to civil society. That's what I do. I go around the world doing that. But there need to be more than just one person doing this, and there are. And then, we need to define that crime in a way that fits in with the role of the ICC. The point I made before, that it just can't be too wide and all-embracing. As great as that would be if it could be in there, but it just wouldn't work. It would fall into political oblivion and be rejected. So, last slide. And I won't bore you with the details, but essentially, I've drafted the crime. You can look at the draft. And then I explain, obviously, why I've drafted it in a particular way. Employing a method of mean of warfare, that's a term of art that is under the laws of armed conflict. It means how you do it, against whom you do it, in what circumstances. I don't differentiate between the armed conflict. It just doesn't make sense. Environmental destruction is deliberate environmental destruction is deliberate environmental destruction. There is no reason, except for politics, why the rules should only apply in international armed conflicts and not in internal ones. And then the hardest thing in the world is to try to work out what is the level of intent. An important point, like genocide, is the crime doesn't exist only after the damage is caused. That would be ludicrous. Because, when do you reach that threshold, etc. The crime is a crime of intent. It is caused when acts are done with this intent. Obviously, to the extent there is environmental destruction, that will aid in the proof. That's part of the factual matrix. But it is ludicrous to say, well, the crime only arises when the damage is caused. I mean, the whole idea of international criminal law, if it has any idea at all, one of it is to deter people. Right? And the manifestation to reach that threshold may take 20 years if you're talking about depleted uranium or something like that. Just like genocide, it would be ludicrous to say the crime of genocide only applies when you've had a genocide. Right? Clearly, that's not the role of international criminal law. So the crime of genocide only applies. It comes into force. It doesn't even have to be one killing. I mean, obviously, again, to the extent there is, that makes it easier to prove, but the crime arises with the intention to destroy. There may be some exceptions. I postulate in here about nuclear weapons. My crime probably would make the use of nuclear weapons illegal, and I obviously make no apologies for that. But there is dicta from the International Court of Justice, the World Court, that talks about, well, there may be circumstances in the absolute last resort where the use of nuclear weapons may be lawful. There's a really famous, or one might say infamous, advisory opinion in 1996 to that effect. And so one has to discuss that, but I make no apologies for the fact that I think if my definition were accepted as it is, then the use of nuclear weapons would almost certainly be unlawful. I think that's a good thing. Other people have criticised me for saying, well, you're setting thresholds essentially to protect the environment more than some of the existing crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes do about protecting people. And people say, and the criticism is, well, that doesn't make sense. And again, I make no apologies for that. I've argued in other fora that we need to upgrade genocide. We need to upgrade crimes against humanity. We need to upgrade war crimes. That's slowly happening. But the fact that those crimes, which are historically based and are very difficult to prove, is not a reason why this should be made more difficult. Does that make sense? One doesn't apply the same flawed standard. But of course, these criticisms are valid. I'm very happy for people to criticise. Essentially, I put my heart and my soul on the line by drafting the crime. And no doubt, many people around the world, when they see this, say, well, a load of rubbish. But that's great, because the debate needs to be had. The debate needs to be had. And I make the point that really appealing to everybody else who's interested in broader environmental things, that this is just one thing, one tool to address, in particular circumstances. And there are other tools, as I said, that deal with other types of environmental degradation, which are equally important. But that wasn't what I set out to cover. It's quite narrow, but I think narrow is good and focused, because you have to deal with these things in a logical, step-by-step way. You can't achieve everything at once. 20 years of law and diplomacy have taught me that. As much as we would like to save the world, it's very rare you have tumultuous, it does happen, but it's very rare that you have tumultuous change covering everything at the same time. Would that it were, it'd be wonderful. But sometimes you need to do this systematically, and no doubt lots of other amazing people are working on other tools to deal with other things, and so this is just one part of that matrix. Okay, I just want to end with a quote, if I may, pardon me, which I think sums it up so much better than I could do in a talk. And so this was a journalist, her name was Ellen Goodman, writing in, when was she writing? In 1991, straight after the oil wells. And she said this, she said, it's to be hoped that eventually, and here's the quote, even in the devastating business of killing each other, there may be enough sanity for a consensus, enough sense of preservation to at least have a rule on the book, and in our minds, against waging war on the very environment we must share when the war is over. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that probably says it so much better than my last 3/4 of an hour, but thank you for your attention.